Hi, I am Dr. Vicente Reyes, and I'm the Unit Coordinator for EDSS279 I warmly welcome you on behalf of the other members of the Social Science team at the School of Education, UNE, to this trimester's EDSS279 units. To open up in this introductory lecture, I am presenting to you two Chinese characters, Mandarin characters. On the one hand, this character means xiao, or small. And then on this side, you see the Chinese character representing shui. Together, they are xiao shui, or primary school, which is the main domain theme that we're going to be talking about for this entire trimester. Now, I have deliberately exposed you to a different way of representing a primary school because one of the recurring messages that you will hear from me as your unit coordinator is the idea of being a critical friend. And one of the roles of a critical friend is to present you with new information, a new way of looking at things, with the objective of helping you succeed. So for this introductory lecture, we will be looking at the main question, why teach social science? And then we're going to take a look at three sub-questions. First, I'm going to introduce you, or for those of you who already know, I'm going to reintroduce you to the idea of critical reflective practice. And then I'm going to walk you or guide you through several exercises with the objective of discovering what characteristic is most important for teachers, particularly for pre-service teachers. Finally, using a geography subject, I will talk about how we can apply critical reflective practice in our teaching. This question number 3 will actually be helpful as you start thinking about your assignment 1. A few housekeepings talking about assessments and assignments. This particular graphic can also be found in Moodle. This is the most updated information about your assessments. The dates are highlighted. Assignment 1 is due on the 18th of July. Assignment 2 is due on the 12th of September. And then you have 2 online group activities using Pinterest board. You are asked to self-select your groups. It is important that you attempt these assessments, right? Because these are mandatory assessment components for this particular unit. The first is due on the 25th of July. That one is a Pinterest board on the theme of geography. And then the second online assessment is due on the 19th of September. That's a Pinterest board on the history resource. This graphic can also be seen on your Moodle site. It presents to you the components and the deadlines for the key assessment tasks for this entire unit. What is a critical reflective practitioner? Well, this is an individual who is constantly engaged in an extended critique of policy and reflections on practice. I view myself, or at least I think I see myself as someone who wants to be a critical reflective practitioner, who's attempting to be one. These images basically is a very short way of introducing myself. In the many years ago, I used to teach in the primary school. This is me. I was teaching in Spain, particularly in the cities of Barcelona, Madrid, and Sevilla. I was a visiting scholar during that time, and aside from teaching, I was actually researching about how schools were created and run in not only Spain but also in France and in Italy. And in doing that research, I looked at 50 schools. One of the insights that I gathered from that 2-year research was the idea of se quema. This is a Spanish phrase which means burn oneself. To interpret this, they're actually referring to teacher burnout. as I reflect about teachers and about learners, I see that teacher burnout is one of the biggest diseases that can strike a teacher, something that we should avoid. That's part of my ongoing reflection. Some time ago, I also became a school principal of a primary school and a secondary school. And as you will realize when you go back to schools, one of the things that you need to contend with, that we teachers need to contend with, is the idea of education reform. As a school principal, this was something that I wrestled with almost every year. And I realized that one of the best ways to navigate the complexities of educational reform was to form networks. So these pictures here are key leading figures of networks of reform in the United States, particularly in Seattle, in New York, and in California. I spent some time there researching about how these networks of reforms function and how they actually influenced education policy in the United States. I'm also very much engaged as a critical reflective practitioner on corruption and how it impacts the provision of education, particularly in developing countries like my own, the Philippines, and some other countries in the region like Indonesia, for example. I look at how corruption negatively impacts education. So in this picture, we see that textbooks that are supposed to be distributed to students are not distributed to them. Instead, they are stacked in warehouses, rotting and not used. Now, I can explain this to you in subsequent lectures why this is the case. In some of the schools that I also visit and research, we see the phenomenon of child soldiers in the Philippines. My country is still at war in the southern part of my nation. And then also some students, some young kids, primary school kids, are actually involved in criminal activities. And this is because of a nation that is suffering from poverty, my home country, the Philippines. 1 out of 4 individuals are suffering from poverty. And this drives people into, some people into criminal activities. I argue that if the education system were not corrupt, these incidences would be much more limited. As a critical friend, I am adopting Arthur Costa and Benna Calic's definition. A critical friend is someone who asks provocative questions, provides data to be examined through another person's lens. A critical friend offers critiques of your work. And as a friend, the critical friend is an advocate for the success of that work. So my role and the role of the other members of the social science team is to be your critical friends. This book right here is my latest publication, published early this year, 2016, and it's an example of how I critically engage with educational policy and practice. This is a book entitled Mapping the Terrain of Education Reform, Global Trends and Local Responses in the Philippines. When I talk about reflective practitioners, I'm actually referring to Donald Shawn's seminal work, The Reflective Practitioner. And I wanted to call attention to 3 types of reflection that he described. One is reflection in action. Another word for this would be surprise. This image portrays my students from Bhutan who visited Armidale last year. And I brought them to one of the schools in town, and they were pleasantly surprised when they actually saw in action how animals were used to try to assist children who may have some difficulties in communication. Uh, they were surprised to see how it actually worked. They've heard, my students from Bhutan have heard how animals were used to address difficulties that some students experience, but to actually see the wonderment in their eyes as in how it was implemented, to me was a surprise. So that is reflection in action. When something that you are familiar with or something that you take for granted is suddenly shown to you in a different lens. Reflection in action. My same set of students from Bhutan, they, after looking at a particular preschool for one entire day, we had a chance to have an extended conversation with the director of the preschool. And in this process, they were able to ask questions about what they saw, what they observed, what they experienced. All teachers I suggest should be undertaking reflection and action. After we teach, at the end of the day, we need to sit down, reflect, take a look at what happened during our day, our lessons. What were the high points? What were the low points? This is reflection and action. And eventually, the goal is to become critical reflective practitioners. These are individuals who don't merely look at reflection and action. Not only are they reflecting on action, but they're actually reflecting constantly, and in the process become continual learners. This is our goal. As teachers, we need to be continually learning, and we need to role model this particular habit so that our learners also become continual learners. I'm going to guide you through several exercises in which you will actually be undertaking reflection in action, reflection and action, and possibly um, start doing some critical reflective practice. We'll start with this particular question. What is most important to the happiness of young adolescents? I'm adopting Aristotle's definition of happiness. In order to make this question even more explicit, I'm going to show you this table. There are 25 items here, life goals and aspirations. Now, I'd like you to think about a typical young adolescent. So, you need to think about the young adolescent's age. Are you looking at someone in the 10 to 11-year-old bracket, 12 to 13-year-old bracket, 13 to 14-year-old bracket? Think about the typical adolescent. And then, if you were that adolescent and if you were given this list, what do you think would be the top 5 choices for that young adolescent? What would be the life goal and aspirations, the top life goal and aspirations of that young adolescent? I will give you a minute, 30 seconds to a minute, to look at the list and choose your top 5. Okay, I hope that you've already chosen what your top 5 life goal aspirations are. I mean, what a typical adolescent would choose. With that list, compare it now with what the actual students responded to. So we are looking at 30,000 students, and we undertook a longitudinal panel study. That means that we traced the same set of students as they progressed from one year to another. So in year 7, what these 30,000 or so students identified as their life goals and aspirations are, well, top one would be to be filial. Filio is taken from the Greek word child. So to be filial means to be an obedient child. That's number 1. To respect myself was number 2. To be a loyal citizen was number 3. To be loyal to the company I will work for was number 4. To have a sense of meaning and purpose in life, number 5, and all the way down. As you can see, in year 8, these rankings changed, and these are the new ranks. Number 1 was to respect myself, to have a sense of meaning and purpose in life, to have a sense of achievement, to be filial, to make my own choices. So I think that whatever you chose may not have been entirely consistent with what the students have responded to. If this is the case, then I think what you would be feeling now would be surprise, perhaps maybe doubt. That's good, because that's actually reflection in action. When you, again, as a critical friend, my role is to present you with data that will make you question some of your existing beliefs. Now, looking at those 25 items, and if we rearrange the data following some theoretical considerations like the work of Bandura, Betts, or Hogan and Donovan, we can actually see that based on the research that we have been doing, young adolescents actually view life goals and aspirations in three concepts or three ways. One is traditional, right? So that talks about parents, to be filial, get married and having children, working in a job. And we have students who are modern, who have modernist notions. And this really talks about independence and agency. Now, usually what happens is that when I do this survey to adults, when I ask them to think about young adolescents, this is where they think most young adolescents are, the postmodern. This really talks more about image. The idea of the image is important. How good looking people think I am, how cool people think I am, to have a boyfriend, girlfriend at that young age. So if you take a look at this table, based on our 30,000 or so respondents, most of them embrace modernist notions of life goals and aspirations. This is followed by those who still embrace traditional life goals and aspirations, and very few embrace postmodern life goals and aspirations. Interesting. My goal in presenting this data is to, again, to prompt you towards reflection and action, to be surprised. Now let's do something which is reflection on action, right? So I'd like you to think about the value of education, your value of education. What for you is the value of education? So I'd like you to identify immediately the top of your head. What is education for? What is its value? That's for you. And now I'd like you to think about what adolescents would think would be the value of education. And I'd like you to think about primary school kids this time. It could be primary, I mean, it could be year four or it could be year five, but I'd like you to focus on the younger adolescents. I mean, adolescence is defined as starting from the age of 10 all the way to 25. So, but I like you to look at the really young kids. Now, I've listed several items here, and thinking about a primary school kid, what do you think would be the top three items that primary school kids would identify as the value of education? I'll give you 30 seconds from this list. Okay, let's take a look at your list and compare it with how young people actually chose. So year four, in 2009, when we administered this survey, admittedly it's been a long time, if you notice, doing well in exams was the one that scored the highest, followed by getting a high-paying job, and followed by learning new things. Right? In this panel longitudinal study, as I indicated earlier, we followed the same set of kids when they were year five. And here in year five, what is most important to them was getting a high-paying job, and then followed by doing well in exams. For older students, year 7 and year 8, consistently it's been getting a high-paying job and getting a high-paying job. Again, the purpose is to try to see this. You could actually see this as part of reflection and action, more surprises. Or you could actually also see it as reflection on action. You think about your own experience as a student. What was the value of education for you? And then you compare it with what young kids are saying. Again, take note that this particular data that I'm sharing with you was, you can see the source below. It's actually in a different context. It's in a Singapore context, not an Australian context. Nonetheless, it's still interesting and insightful information to look at. If you're asking whether we have something similar to Australia, well, the quick answer is we don't, right? This research that I took part of in Singapore, it cost us about $30 million. So it's an expensive project to actually track what young people think about in relation to their teaching and learning experiences. Now we move on to more reflection and action. And here is a table, and here are some what we call pedagogical practices. Basically, the question is, what are the components of a typical teaching day? And we have pedagogical practices that start with management of student attention and behavior, all the way to structure and clarity, drill and worksheets, pacing, that's how fast or how slow you teach in a class. Wait time, you ask a question, how long or how short do you wait when waiting for responses. Reviewing what was taught, providing feedback, giving a didactic lecture, using memorization, talking about the significance of subjects and its meaningfulness, going deep into a particular subject matter, having classroom discussion, connecting subjects to real events, focusing on the textbook, integrating knowledge. For example, if you're teaching geography, do you actually use, for example, maths or science alongside with it? And then creativity and criticality. In the research that we undertook, the one that I was talking to you about just now, we actually mapped what we referred to as pedagogical practices. Now, I'd like you to spend maybe 30 seconds to think about what pedagogical practice among the list here for primary school is the one that is most used in your experience. Which one is the one most used? Identify the top three. Which particular pedagogical practices is used often? All right, now let's compare what you identified with what was observed. So in getting this data, what we did was we looked at 2,139 teachers and about 1,884 secondary school teachers. We trained qualitative research code specialists. We sent them to 39 primary schools and 41 secondary schools, and they actually sat in classrooms and observed the pedagogical practices that were happening in the classrooms. And this is what they saw. So management of student attention behavior had the highest mean. That means this is the one that was practiced a lot. And creativity and criticality, which is from the context where this research was undertaken in Singapore, which was really the main focus. They wanted to find out how creativity and criticality was taught in schools. And true enough, when they take a look at pedagogical practices, it's the least reported practice observed among teachers. It's an issue that until now they're still trying to address how to foster greater creativity and criticality in their context. You're aware that in Singapore they're very good. They're one of the best education systems in the world. They're very good in examinations. They're high in PISA. They're high in the PEARLS, the primary school reading and language test. They're high in TIMS, the test in maths and science. But one area that they identify they need to really work on is creativity and criticality among their students. Now, I just showed you pedagogical practices. Managing student behavior was the one that was reported most, and then all the way down, creativity and criticality. This particular set of questions now brings us to the realm of critical reflective practice. What teacher characteristics correspond to pedagogical practices? Given a set of choices, how would you rank these characteristics in terms of how they impact pedagogical practices? So here I'm enumerating 5 teacher characteristics. One would be teacher qualifications, certificates. Another one would be teacher experience, work experience. Teacher age, whether someone is young or whether someone is a veteran. Teacher commitment or passion. And teacher efficacy, belief in one's ability. Remembering what the pedagogical practices were just now, and these teacher characteristics, what do you think, which particular characteristics have the greatest impact on pedagogical practice? In other words, does one become a good teacher because of qualifications, experience, age, commitment, or efficacy? So I'd like you to rank 1, the least impact, 5, the greatest impact. Rank these teacher characteristics. I give you 15 seconds to do this. Okay, now that you have made your ranking, I wonder if what you have indicated corresponds to what um, has been discovered in our research in a Singapore context. So if you can see, this is a table of correlations. On this column, you see all the pedagogical practices: depth of understanding, creativity, criticality, integration, all the way down to classroom discussion. And then this is the primary school teachers. These are secondary school teachers. These are the characteristics: qualifications, experience, age, commitment, efficacy. Same for secondary. To read the correlation table, you take a look at the numbers and look for numbers that are higher than 0.30. And you also need to know that you also need to determine whether they're statistically significant. In other words, the relationship is not due to chance. So if you take a look at the table, you will see that, for example, in depth of understanding, qualifications is negatively correlated and it's not statistically significant. Experience is statistically significant. You see the double asterisks here, but the correlation coefficient is so low, 0.06. The highest is 0.49, efficacy. And this goes on for all the pedagogical practices. The same story can be seen for secondary. And in fact, as some of you answered qualifications as the most important characteristic, if you take a look at, let's say, creativity and criticality, the data tells us that it's negatively correlated. This means that the more qualified the teachers are, the less they teach creativity and criticality. Interesting. Now, what this tells us is that efficacy is the most important characteristic in terms of teachers in order to become good teachers. This happens in Singapore, but it also happens around the world. In fact, research by Dr. Megan Channon Morat, a friend of mine, she wrote a book, she wrote an article in 2001 titled Teacher Efficacy, Capturing an Elusive Construct. She and Dr. Anita Woolfolk Oy define teacher efficacy as efficacy or effectiveness for instructional strategies, effectiveness for classroom management, and effectiveness for student engagement. These three components contribute to the idea of teacher efficacy. This can't be learned in one go. This is something that needs to be done continually. Instructional strategies, you need to learn a lot more. Experience adds onto it. Classroom management, initially it will be tough to manage classes, but as you continue to learn, you become good at it. Student engagement, you experiment what tricks work, what activities engage the students. So it's really a continuous learning experience. One has to become a critical reflective practitioner, continuously learning, in order for one to become an efficacious teacher. So I've already covered the first idea. I hope I've spoken about critical reflective practice. Second, I've spoken about the important characteristic of teachers, what the most important characteristic is, and that is teacher efficacy. Now we go to the third part, which is essentially an example of how I can use one subject, for example, geography, in facilitating the learning of young kids and in the process making them critical reflective practitioners. I'll do that by looking at the Year 6 curriculum, the Australian curriculum, not the New South Wales, but the Australian curriculum. And I'd like to focus on geography. So the objective, the outcome I'm looking at is this particular one here, the geographical diversity of the Asian region and the location of its major countries in relation to Australia. The achievement standard for Year 6 is that students are able to describe, compare, and explain the diverse characteristics of different places in different locations from local to the global scale. So I might start this lesson by uh, showing this image to my students. I will follow the principle of scaffolding by Jerome Bruner. So I will role model. So I'll do it first. Small activities, I'll do it first for my year 6 students. I'll tell them, takes me, well, I'll show them this map and I'll ask them, what country do you think this is? So the goal is for them to describe, well, they should be able to describe it. This is Australia, right? And we can talk about the bodies of water around it. Again, part of describing in geographic spatial terms. So I will tell my year 6 students, it takes me around 8 hours to travel from Manila, the capital of the Philippines, to Sydney. If the average speed of commercial planes is about 805 kilometers per hour, how far is the Philippines from Australia? This is a very geographic question, but here I'm actually asking students to integrate what they've learned in mathematics, ratio and proportion. After I've shown them the computation, I'll then bring their attention to the computers and tell them, actually, if I use Google Map and if I trace a line from Sydney all the way to Manila up there, it will actually generate some figures, and that's actually the distance between these two cities. The same question that they asked earlier that I answered manually, I can actually do by using technology. So here I integrate not only the other subjects of math, but also the use of technology in addressing some learning activities in geography. So I have role modeled. Now this time around, I like them to do it. So I go even smaller to my home country and tell them, this is my hometown, a city called Tacloban City. And I'll tell them that this is where my house is, and I'll tell them that this is where the multipurpose hall is. I will tell them that it takes me around 10 to 15 minutes or 16 minutes to walk from my house to the multipurpose hall. And if I say to them that the average speed of an average adult is 80 meters per minute, how far is the multipurpose hall from my house? So I'll tell them you can use whatever device, whatever approach you may in order to find out the answers. Some of them might do this manually, or some of them might use their computers or their iPads and use Google Map and trace a line from my house all the way to the multipurpose hall, and it will tell us what the distance is. This time around, they do it. After they've done that activity, I then go to the main point of my subject, right? So I want to actually introduce them to the phenomenon of storm surges. So I could show I could show them this YouTube video, but I won't show it to you now. But again, I'm integrating technology to the learning activities of young learners. And then I remind them about a natural event that happened in 2012 in the Philippines, in my hometown, in Tacloban City. I will remind them about the international typhoon codenamed Haiyan, which has been described as the strongest ever typhoon to hit land in history. So we're talking about up to about 300 plus kilometer per hour winds. So it hit my hometown in 2012, in November 2012. I'll show them the picture of my hometown sometime in February of 2012. And then I'll show them a picture of my hometown the day after the typhoon hit, and the storm surge from the bay surrounding the city submerged the entire city. So they can see that all the color, all the houses that you should be able to see in this picture have all disappeared. The devastating effect of the storm surge. And I can start telling them stories about my family, my relatives, my friends who endured the sufferings of the catastrophe. It goes without saying that this catastrophe has been one of the worst ever in the history of mankind, we were talking about almost 20,000 people who lost their lives. Now, I will tell them these stories, and in doing so, I'm actually uh, engaging with what Betty Rosen said in her book, And None of It Was Nonsense: The Power of Storytelling in Schools. I argue that when we use storytelling in schools, what we're actually doing is we're nurturing networks of young learners and introducing them to the idea of critically reflecting and practicing this in their classrooms. So that first group talked about describing. Now we're going to take a look at the other achievement area, which is comparing. So I'll tell them that when that storm surge hit my home country, something quite strange happened. So this is where Tacloban City is. And right here is a small town called General MacArthur in Samar, which is the next city. The storm came from this particular sea right here, body of water, and it struck this part of my country, the eastern part of the country. More than 20,000 people and counting, because until now there's still a lot of missing people, and they're encountering bodies in the rural areas. 20,000 people perished in this city, whereas in this small community, very few people died. In fact, no one died as a result of the storm surge, but some people died later on because of the effects of the illnesses, the diseases, the waterborne diseases that happened. But during the storm itself, there were almost zero casualties in this town. What were the main differences between MacArthur Town and Tacloban City? The storm went through the same path, hit the same area, which is not too far from each other. But why is it that one community suffered tremendously, Tacloban City, my hometown, and one did not? So here they start thinking about comparing and contrasting. And then I showed them a video, and in this video it talks about mangroves. In General MacArthur town, the one that's right next to the city, they had a very rich mangrove forest. And these mangroves actually helped protect their community from the storm surge. It was really the storm surge that killed so many people. And then I can actually ask the students to now talk about similar experiences where nature either prevented more disaster from happening or nature making the situation worse, right? And I could actually ask the students to capture these small short stories using their iPhones, sorry, using their smartphones, capturing this, right? And this is an example of what Joe Lambert describes as digital storytelling, capturing lives, creating community, a very important way, again, of nurturing networks of critical learners. So here I accomplish comparing and contrasting. Then I move on to explaining, which is the third year six achievement standard. So from the Philippines, I bring them back to Australia. And I remind the students about the storm surge that happened. Well, we just had a massive storm surge in New South Wales not long ago, maybe a week ago. But then I'll tell them that in 2015, something similar happened at Woolly Creek in the Canterbury area of New South Wales. And I'll tell them that around that Woolly Creek, you can actually also find mangroves. But those mangroves were cut because of the demands of development, of progress. They were cut because in Sydney they're creating the controversial West Connects road network, the big highway, right? And then I actually also remind them about the floods that happened in 2010 in Brisbane. In July 2010, they removed 300 to 400 mango trees along South Bank because they wanted to make it appear prettier. They wanted to decorate the bank. And then in December 2010 of the same year, catastrophic floods swept through South Bank and the low-lying areas near the rivers. The really intriguing thing about this is that the mangroves that you find in the South Bank, the ones in Woody Creek and the ones in Tacloban City, are the same mangroves. They're called Avicenna marina, or white and gray mangroves. So here you're able to, as a teacher, you're able to actually let the students link and identify that these disparate places in different parts of the world actually have some commonalities, the mangroves. And the way that we treat nature has had various impacts to society. In General MacArthur community, it protected the lives of people. In Tacloban City, a lot of people were, a lot of lives were lost because of the storm surge. In Woolly Creek, um, there was actually one casualty there. In South Bank, same thing happened, and we can point out to the the abuse and the lack of taking care of nature that has happened. We can then go back to the students and ask them to share their stories about their reflections on this, and they can do this as small groups or as partners, and they start sharing stories of what they heard in their families or what they themselves experienced. Then I can actually show them this video of young kids, young primary school and lower secondary school kids in Tacloban City who talk about their experiences after that catastrophic typhoon. And what this particular YouTube video does is it compiles these stories of these young kids. As a class activity, that can also be done. Everyone could share videos of the stories of your students, and then as a class, they choose five which they would like to highlight and showcase, maybe upload it to a YouTube video so that people will get to see what stories they have in relation to uh, the idea of storm surges, the idea of how we take care of nature, the idea of how it impacts society. So in this way, we're able to achieve the goal of looking at the subject of geography and applying it to issues, life and death issues that affect our societies and communities. So that is our first lecture in relation to EDSS 279 379. Thank you very much.